Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the webcast, Building Resilient Leaders, sponsored by TRACOM Group.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to our webinar, Building Resilient Leaders for Organizational Success. My name is David Collins. I'm the Vice President and General Manager here at TRACOM Group, the social intelligence company. And today we're looking forward to providing for you a really good educational session on resiliency and resilient leaders, and I hope you enjoy it. I'm going to be joined today by two of my colleagues. First, Dr. Natalie Wolfson. Natalie, could I ask you to introduce yourself quickly?
Hello, I'm an organizational research consultant at TRACOM, and I'm looking forward to discussing some interesting material with you today.
Great. Thanks very much, Natalie. And we're also going to be joined by another one of our colleagues here at TRACOM, Dr. Casey Mulqueen. Casey?
Sure. Thanks, David. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining our webinar. I think you'll find some really interesting things today.
Thanks again, Casey. So why don't we go ahead and get started and go to the next slide. I think if you look at today's workplace, there's very, very little doubt that the workplace today has become significantly busier with a lot more change and perhaps even more stressful than it's ever been. And when you look at that, that stress ultimately has a lot of impact on us both as employees and also as leaders of organizations. According to a recent American Psychological Association, stress in today's workplace is very significant. 69% of employees report that work is a significant source of stress, and a full 41% say that they typically feel tense or even stressed out during the workday. 51% of employees said they're less productive at work due to stress. 52% of people made decisions about careers and career changes, things like looking for a new job, declining a promotion, or even leaving a job based on workplace stress. And of course, job pressure now is actually cited as the #1 cause of stress in the United States. When we're talking about job pressure, we're talking about things like coworker tensions, the ability to work well with your boss, and of course, one of our favorites that we're all dealing with today, I think, is work overload. And the impact of this is not only is that stress something that impacts us both from our own well-being in terms of how much we enjoy our career, our job, and what we're doing, but it also has some very significant health issues for us. And stress has been linked to the 6 leading causes of death, including things like heart disease, cancer, and the like. And so when you think about it, resiliency is absolutely a necessary skill in today's workplace to not only thrive in the workplace, but in some instances to survive. And hopefully during today's webinar, you're going to learn quite a bit about that, some strategies that you can take away with to improve your own resiliency, and ultimately the resiliency perhaps of those people that report into you as leaders as well. If I could go to the next slide, please. One of the things that we're targeting with our webinar today is obviously we're targeting about leaders and resilience for leaders in the organization. And I think as leaders, one of the things that's really important to be aware of is there's almost a double impact of resiliency. First, many times leaders are sitting at the actual epicenter of where all the stress occurs, both the demands of the organization from getting things done, launching new projects, hitting tight deadlines, and then also dealing with people that work on your team and actually motivating and getting people to be responsive to those needs and to what's being done. And so as leaders, I think it's important to note that not only do we need to have high resiliency, but if you think about the impact that our behaviors, our actions, our resiliency have, you'll find that emotions are in fact contagious. And so when you find yourself as a leader reacting to stress, reacting to your environment, and perhaps demonstrating some behaviors that are not resilient and actually showing some of those things, not only are you having an impact on yourself, but more importantly, you're actually magnifying that impact on your team throughout. And so this is a very important topic, and we're very excited to share it with you. So next slide, please. So when you look at the impact and you really think about it, not only is the impact on the person, not only impact on the leader, but of course we all work for organizations that have very specific business objectives that we're trying to achieve. And so if you begin to take a look at some of the studies that have been done that attempt to quantify the actual cost of this organizational stress, it's absolutely huge. It's over $300 billion for the cost just of American companies alone annually. Stress is cited in over 1 million daily American work absences. And stress is much more likely to cause absences than workplace accidents or even disease itself, the common cold or the flu. In fact, it's 4 times more likely. And so our agenda today, if we can go to the next slide, is to talk with you about what is resilience and actually why is it important. We want to talk a little about what holds us back from being resilient. And then I think what we're really hoping that you're going to take away with is some important strategies for how you can go about not only understanding it, but enhancing your own resilience and the implications for resilience in leaders, not just for yourself, but some things that you can do to make your teams that report to you more resilient. So I think without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So Casey?
Thanks, David. So let's jump in and talk about what exactly resilience is. And I think Walt Disney did a good job of describing it a little bit when he talked about his own life, where he said, all the adversity that he's had in his life, the troubles and obstacles have strengthened me. And that's really what adversity is all about. So we talk about resilient people as being flexible and adaptable to change. But that's just one aspect of resiliency. So I know a lot of people who I think are flexible and adaptable to change, but I wouldn't necessarily describe them as resilient people. But what really sets resilient people apart is the fact that they find opportunities within their challenges and opportunities within adversity that they face. So we talk about resilient people as bouncing forward rather than just bouncing back from adversity. And that's really the hallmark of resiliency. So they do more than just recover. They often thrive in the face of adversity. So there's kind of a proactive element there in their thinking and their behavior rather than just a reactive element to challenges of life. So moving forward, why does resiliency matter? Why are you sitting here listening to us talk about resiliency? Well, we've looked into the research on this, and it's really pretty clear. And the first thing that it shows is that resiliency is related to job performance. So we know that highly resilient people simply perform better in their jobs. Their performance evaluations and other measures of their performance tend to be higher and better than people who are not resilient. So that's a good thing right there. And moving on, one more slide further now. The second thing that we found from the research is that resilient people are really committed to their organizations. So when they do surveys, they say, I am committed to this organization. And this is really good in a couple of ways. It's good for those individuals, but it's also good for the companies that they work for. It's good for the individuals because people who are committed to their organizations are highly engaged in their work. And people who are engaged in their work perform better, as I just mentioned. And also people who are highly engaged are less likely to leave their companies. So these are good workers, they're good performers, they're committed, and they stay with their companies. So it's really good all around. And the third way is work-life balance. And a lot of people are talking now about work-life integration rather than work-life balance. But no matter how you conceptualize it or define it, people who are highly resilient do a really good job in this area. They don't let the stressors bleed into other areas of life as much. So they're able to compartmentalize and kind of flow between these areas of life with more ease than people who do not have these resilient characteristics. And then finally, what the research shows is that resilient people embrace change. And that's, of course, important because change is ubiquitous in organizations. So instead of being paralyzed by change or ignoring it or resisting it, they find those opportunities that I talked about before. So they'll actually look for opportunities when change occurs at the work rather than trying to resist it or ignoring it. So we summarize this section with a little picture of a tortoise here. And the reason we put this up is because when we're talking to people about resiliency, sometimes I'll ask them, what is Charles Darwin most well known for? Or what quote would you come up with that you recognize as being from Charles Darwin? And people will often say something like, it's the strongest of the species that survives. And that's what Darwinism is all about. But that's actually not what he said. He was really misquoted. He said, it's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, one most responsive to change. So we like to use that because even in biological and evolutionary terms, resiliency is key to survival. So with that as a little bit of a background just on what resiliency is and why it's important, I want to do a little activity with you all. So I want you to look at this woman's face, and I want you to determine what emotion she's expressing. And if you'll please use the questions feature, just type in, one word or a very brief phrase of what emotion that you believe this woman is expressing. and I'll share those back with the audience. Okay. Frustration, empathy, baffled, pensive, indecisive, contented, she's pondering, concern. These are all coming by pretty quickly. Thoughtful, there's a content in there. I can't believe you just said that, Ken said. She's listening. So a number of responses, and it unsure, it's just come in. Somebody said it looks like no emotion. So what's interesting about that, when we do this exercise, is that focus, somebody just said, is that we get such a range of emotions. So there's a lot of people out there listening, and we're getting, thinking just came through, we're getting emotions from all corners here. So there's not even a lot of agreement. People think that she's expressing something different. So that's interesting by itself. But also what you notice here is that of all the words that I said, most of them tend to be a little bit more on the negative side. Some people say positive. Somebody just said joy, thoughtful. But the reactions tend to be that she's concerned, that she's frustrated, that she's pensive. And that's interesting because this face actually comes from a research study, and it was designed, it was actually computer morphed to be ambiguous in her expression. So she's roughly neutral in her expression of positive or negative emotions. Yet, whenever we do this experiment, most people tend to come up with negative words to describe her emotional expression. And this highlights something called the negativity bias. And the negativity bias describes something about human beings that we're all hardwired at a neurological level to focus more on negative events rather than positive events. So we actively look for threats in our environments instead of opportunities. So we put up some smiling faces here, but if we ran an experiment here where we put up images of a crowd of people, and most of them had either neutral expressions or were smiling, but there was one person in the crowd that was frowning, what you would see is that people's attention is naturally drawn to that frowning face, and that's what they'll remember about that picture rather than all the smiling or neutral faces. So we're just simply hardwired to disregard positive things like opportunities, and that's important at work because when unexpected things happen, things like reorganizations or new assignments or changes in priorities, our brains tell us at a subconscious level that this is a bad thing. This is a threat to my well-being, and I need to fight against it or I need to escape it. So this negativity bias is a hidden barrier. It actually prevents us from being as resilient as we can be. So what I'm going to do now is turn it over to Natalie, and she's going to talk about some really interesting research findings on this negativity bias.
Okay, hello. So there's a lot of evidence to support the negativity bias. So for example, in one study, researchers showed participants pictures of positive, negative, and neutral stimuli, and they looked inside the brain and they found that electrical activity in the cerebral cortex was stronger towards negative stimuli compared to positive or neutral stimuli. So this shows that we're wired to focus on negative things. Next slide, please. And the negativity bias also shows up in our language. So for example, we have 558 emotion words in the dictionary, and 62% of them are negative, and only 38% of them are positive. And of the most common emotion words that people use, 70% of them are negative. So this means that we have a more complex and varied way of thinking about negative feelings compared to positive ones. Okay, so if you have a bad day, what's your mood the following day? What about if you have a good day? So there's evidence that having a bad day is associated with lower well-being the following day, but having a good day is not associated with higher well-being the following day. So this means that bad events have effects that are not only stronger, but longer lasting, more enduring compared to good events. Okay, so the negativity bias actually has an evolutionary basis. So I want to do a little thought exercise with you. Imagine you're in ancient times and you hear the growl of a saber-toothed tiger. What do you feel? what do? Well, your body engaged in an incredible stress response. The amygdala, which is the alarm system of your brain, it fired and it released adrenaline and other stress hormones into your bloodstream. Your heart rate went up, your breathing went up, your blood pressure went up, and this stress response was really adaptive for survival because it mobilized you for this instantaneous fight or flight response. Next slide, please. Okay, so based on what I just said, which of these characters do you think survived the saber-toothed tiger attack? The guy running for his life or the guy dreaming about the cave girl next door? So based on what I said, ancient people, they weren't concerned with seeking out opportunities or rewards or seeking out pleasures in life. They needed to respond quickly to threats that were imminent and immediate, like attacks from saber-toothed tigers or natural disasters. And the people who survived were the ones who could best focus on danger and avoid these threats. So the negativity bias emerged out of this evolutionary history, and it kind of perpetuated over time. So in modern times, threats aren't physical. They aren't life or death. They're more psychological in nature. For example, threats to our sense of self-control or self-esteem and so on. But these types of threats still trigger a powerful amygdala response. For example, imagine your boss asks you, can we talk about some figures on your report? It's a relatively innocuous statement, but it might trigger this surge of fear that you did something wrong. Or if your boss says, Bob, please come see me after lunch, you may have this automatic thought that you're going to be fired. So this is how the negativity bias affects us today. To some degree, our brain is wired to make us afraid and easily hijacked by alarm. And we're wired to walk around with this undercurrent of anxiety, and that really keeps us from being resilient. So people find themselves in this constant state of stress. You know, they overestimate threat, they don't see opportunity in adversity, but leaders have an opportunity to make change a positive focus.
Hey, Natalie, this is David. I have a quick question for you. I think that's really interesting, the negativity bias. The question that I have for you, if you think about most of us in the workplace, in the work world, how many of us are actually aware of the fact that this bias is there and the impact that it has on us? Is that something natural for us to understand?
No, it isn't. The negativity bias really happens below our awareness. So human beings, they have two brain systems. One is automatic and impressionistic. So for example, if I say, what's 2 times 2, this automatic part of your brain will automatically bring to mind 4. You know, emotions are also very automatic. The other brain system is very effortful, it's conscious, it's responsible for rational thought and problem solving, but it's slow. So it's something that you would recruit if you were trying to answer the question, what's 9 times 28? And the automatic mode of our brain is really helpful in some cases, but it's often wrong. And this is the part of the brain that produces the negativity bias. And because the negativity bias is so hardwired into our thinking, we don't notice it, but it really holds us back in a lot of ways.
It's funny you should mention the don't notice it, saying we don't notice it about ourselves as leaders that might be undergoing that level of stress, and when the negativity bias kicks in. Can other people actually see that stress? And if they can, how does that end up impacting?
Yes, they can. So you mentioned previously the idea of emotional contagion, and that's a well-known concept in the psychological literature. And emotional contagion basically happens when a person or a group transmits their emotional state to influence the emotions of another group or person. So when we're interacting with people, we unconsciously mimic their emotional expressions. And studies have found that when we mimic these emotional expressions, this leads our brain to interpret these expressions as our own feeling. So what this means is that we're really susceptible to catching other people's emotions. And leaders, in particular, because they have this high level of authority, can have a really significant impact on the emotional state of their employees and the overall work environment. So when a leader is demonstrating stress, his mood could permeate throughout the entire work group. He could induce stress in other people and his work team, drain their energy, and this could affect the entire organization. And it could have long-term effects on the health and productivity of his workers. So it's very critical that a leader's role in terms of managing stress is really critical to determining the overall environment and stress level of his employees.
Great, thanks. I guess we should go on.
Okay, well, I'll take over from here. Thanks, Natalie and David. What they were just talking about was really the effects and the impacts that the negativity bias has, which is pretty extensive, and also the mechanisms underlying it. But what's really interesting in recent years, and I don't know how much you've read about neuroplasticity, and just neuroscience in general recently has really exploded. But what's really exciting is that recently we learned not only the mechanisms that underlie the negativity bias, but also how to counteract it. So research using MRIs and other advances in brain imaging have really helped us to understand how the brain functions. And it turns out that the brain is much more malleable than we previously realized. So we used to think that you're kind of born with the brain that you're born with, and there wasn't much that you could do about that. You were as intelligent and as malleable and resilient as you were ever going to be. But what they found recently is that that's really not so true. The adult brain is really capable of learning new things and can literally rewire itself. And this is called neuroplasticity. So our evolution can't necessarily always keep up with the technological changes and the pace of the modern work life, but we can still learn some strategies to help ourselves. So we're showing sort of an image of the brain, and we just want to talk a little bit about that because it's really important to understand some of the neurological mechanisms that underlie this negativity bias and how to counteract that. So the brain evolved much like an onion grows from the inside out. So that area highlighted in pink is actually underneath the blue area. It's right near on the inside of the brain, near the brain stem, and it's sometimes called the primitive brain. So it's underneath the outer layers, and it was actually the first part of the brain to form, and it's all that prehistoric people had that Natalie was talking about through her example. And we still have that part of the brain, and it still has a pretty dramatic effect on us. And this is actually where that fight or flight response originates and the negativity bias that Natalie described. And in particular, there's a small structure called the amygdala that releases adrenaline and some other stress hormones, and that's responsible for that fight or flight response and also for the negativity bias. So it's important, we need it, it saves our lives when we're in danger, but unfortunately it affects us when we're not in danger. The prefrontal cortex, if you can go back to the previous slide, please. The prefrontal cortex is part of that outer layer of the brain. So the neocortex is the newer part. That's what it literally means, new brain. The prefrontal cortex at the front of the brain is responsible for logical reasoning and problem solving. So it's what helps us be the high-functioning human beings that we are. And neuroscientists have only recently discovered that there's actually a direct link between that prefrontal cortex and the emotional center of the brain. So they're connected to one another, and that means that they can influence one another. And that means that we can use that prefrontal cortex to control and temper the stress response that we get from the amygdala. And that's actually the basis for one of the strategies that we can use to enhance resilience that we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. So next slide, please. In the modern world, we don't have tigers chasing us down every day, fortunately. But unfortunately, our brains still respond in the same way when we're confronted with threat. And the threats that we feel now are more psychological. So we feel threats to our self-esteem, to our autonomy, to our ego, and things like that. And our brains can't distinguish very easily between what's a real meaningful physical threat and what isn't. So we still respond in much the same way. And what research has shown is that this list here, these are the top 5 amygdala triggers at work. So these shouldn't be too surprising if you think about it when you feel like you're being disrespected by people at work, when you feel like you're being treated unfairly, unappreciated, unheard, and then when you're facing unrealistic deadlines that are outside of your control. These are things that trigger that amygdala. You still have that same kind of fight or flight stress response as you would have if you were actually physically threatened. So that's a little bit just around the neuroscience behind it and the amygdala triggers. But what we like to use when we talk with people about this in more details, instead of remembering all those things, we just use a metaphor of the low road and the high road. So the low road is really your amygdala at work. So you'll get to where you're going, but the ride's going to be pretty bumpy. You might injure some people along the way and get into a fender bender. And the high road is when you engage consciously and use your prefrontal cortex. So it's slower, it might take longer, but in the end it's much safer and you'll get better results by using that method. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Natalie, and she's going to talk about some characteristics that help people to be resilient.
And Natalie, this is David. Just 1 second here before you start. I've been looking at the questions box, and it looks like our group out here is pretty good at using it. I know they used it with the exercise with Casey, and there's several questions in here about if we'll share the slides, if we'll share some of the research. I think the answer to that question is definitely yes. At the end of this webinar, I forgot to mention earlier, we are going to have a Q&A session. So at this point, from here on forward, I'd probably encourage the group to think about any questions that you'd like us to answer as we're reviewing the individual slides and topics and concepts, and just go ahead and type them in that questions box. And in the last 10 to 15 minutes or so of the webinar, we'll do our absolutely best job to get to as many of those questions as we can. So again, with that question box, just go ahead and type those in, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So thank you very much, and Natalie, let me turn it back to you.
Sure. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the elements of resiliency. And in our research, we found that resilience is made up of 9 elements, and they can be categorized into a broader 3-dimensional framework. First, how you filter information and interpret the world, and this is mostly internal. You know, it's hard for other people to see that. Next, how you act, how you behave and respond to difficulty and adversity. This is more external. And finally, how you interact, how you communicate and connect with other people. And this is also, for the most part, more external. So I'll talk about the individual elements within each of these 3 dimensions. So within the filter dimension, first we have personal responsibility. And personal responsibility is the belief that successes or failures at work are determined by your own talents, your own motivations, as opposed to things you can't control, like luck. And those who are high in this quality, they believe that they control their career destiny. They believe that if they work hard, that they can achieve what they want to. And because they rely on themselves to make things happen, they're more active in their approach to life. So they'll make connections with people, they'll initiate projects, and they're much less prone to depression or stress. And next is realistic optimism. So this is a tendency to see the world in a positive way, but also be grounded in reality. So people who are high in this, they believe the future is going to be good, but they anticipate and plan for challenges. Then there's personal beliefs, the sense that life has deep meaning and purpose. And this can come from a lot of different sources. Some people get it from religion. Some people get it from spirituality. Some people get it from devotion to a particular value system, devotion to a particular cause. And people who are high in this, they feel connected to causes that they feel are larger than themselves. They have a sense of calling. They have personal values that provide them with comfort. And these personal beliefs are really stabilizing in difficult times. Then under the ACT dimensions, we have self-assurance. So self-assurance is the belief in oneself to successfully perform at work. And people who are high in self-assurance have confidence in their professional skills and in their ability to handle challenges. They tend to develop a deeper interest and commitment and engagement with tasks. They're also more motivated, so they try harder and they persist even when unexpected challenges arise. Next is problem solving. Oh, self-composure, sorry. Self-composure, the ability to manage stress and remain calm under pressure. People who are high in this, they remain focused and committed in the face of stress. They deal with challenges rationally rather than allowing their emotional brain to take over and drive their decisions. And next is problem solving, the ability to plan and resolve problems effectively. And people who are high in this, they find solutions to problems that other people might find overwhelming or overly complex. And they take time to define the problem, to gather relevant information, to form an innovative strategy using reason and creativity. And next is goal orientation, being goal-focused, setting ambitious but achievable goals, monitoring progress on those goals, and then adjusting your behavior based on that. And then in the interact dimension, we have two elements. The first is courageous communication, the ability to communicate with others in a candid and courageous way. People who are high on this, they're open and they share their ideas freely. They're willing to have difficult conversations with people, even if they may be uncomfortable, because they're important and they help them move towards their goals. And finally, social support. So this is the perception that you're part of a supportive social network. It includes having close confidants, people you can discuss important matters with, and quality is more important than quantity here. So one person with one very strong tie might feel much more socially connected and supported than somebody who has a lot of really weak ties. So that's important to mention. And there are 6 really critical strategies for enhancing resiliency in your professional life. Each of these strategies enhances multiple elements of resiliency at once. So it's really, each of these strategies are very powerful in that sense. And Casey's going to talk about one fundamental strategy for improving resiliency. It's the first one up on the slide, called challenging your automatic beliefs.
Thanks, Natalie. So we have limited time, so we can't only talk about one of these, and I'm going to talk about that first one, challenging automatic beliefs, because it really is fundamental. And the reason we talked about the science behind the negativity bias and the link between the prefrontal cortex and the emotional part of the brain is because this really does have a dramatic effect on resilience. And it really is the underpinning of this strategy, which is challenging automatic beliefs. So we're going to describe this to you through a little scenario here. So this woman is a leader, and she's just lost one of her team members to a promotion. So this person was promoted to a job in another department. So she's happy for that person. It's a good thing for him, but it's going to cause problems for her. So he's going to have to be replaced. She's got deadlines coming up, and so on. So that's the challenge for her. That's the C, the challenge. So she understandably, you can go back to the previous slide, please. She understandably reacts to this with some behavior and some emotions. And emotions first. So she feels happy for the person. It's a little bit of a mixed blessing here. She's glad for him. But she feels frustrated, perturbed, you name it, because of all these problems that it's going to bring for her and for her work and for the rest of her team. So those are the emotions she feels. And then she responds in some way behaviorally. So here it's probably a little over the top of cursing at her computer or something, but maybe complaining to others. She might have, at least for a day or so, some behavioral responses to this. She might be in a bad mood towards others. You name it, it's going to vary by the person. So the 2 things I want you to pay attention to, her challenge, this person's leaving, and then how she responds, the emotions she feels and the behavior that she engages in. So next slide, please. That scenario is actually not as cut and dry as what I described it as. And that's because between the challenge and the behavior, there's an intervening step. So we all have these automatic beliefs that enter our heads. And it happens very quickly, and it's below our conscious awareness. And it's these automatic beliefs that lead to the stressful emotions and behaviors that we engage in. So what are this person's automatic beliefs? She might be saying this guy was invaluable to the team. He can't be replaced. There's no way we'll finish our project on time. We can't meet our deadlines. She might even be telling herself, this is going to reflect poorly on me as a team leader because somebody's left and I can't deal with it and we can't meet our obligations in a timely way. So keep in mind, these things are all happening at the subconscious level. She would not even be aware of these automatic thoughts necessarily. And so we call this the cab model because when you're driving in a cab, where are you? You're riding in the back seat. So you're out of control. You kind of know where you're going, but you're not in control of how you get there. You're being taken along for a ride. So we refer to this as the cab model. Challenge, automatic thinking, and then behavior and emotion. So next slide, please. So what we do when we're working with people and helping them to learn to be more resilient is we want to get people back into the car so they're the drivers. So we help people to use their logical brain to counteract those automatic beliefs that come from the emotional part of the brain. And we do this by slowing down, engaging that prefrontal cortex to recognize what those automatic beliefs are, and then to logically counteract those. So we move from being taken to a ride to becoming the driver. And this is done through active thinking, which leads to more realistic, less stressful, and more productive responses. So going back to our example of that woman, instead of panicking, she could slow down, think through the situation. So she can say to herself, what can I do to dispute these beliefs? First of all, she has to recognize them. She can think through the implications and options. She might recognize some options for herself, such as clearly communicating with her own boss what the implications are of losing that team member. And she can even go a step further by trying to develop some good options and solutions to the issue before meeting with her boss. That would be that proactive element of resiliency that I talked about before. And she can tell herself, even if that person can't be replaced quickly with someone who's equally talented, is the situation really as dire as I'm leading myself to believe? She can remind herself she's a good team leader, she's not in any trouble, and that she and her team have performed well in the past. So those initial automatic beliefs are probably not very realistic, and they need to be replaced with more active, realistic thoughts. So go ahead, next slide, please. So that's really the process. It's as straightforward as that. The one thing that never changes is the challenge. So the C in the model stays. We can't change that. We can't control our environments and everything that happens to us, but we can change our responses to adversity in our lives. So next slide, please. Now, I gave some examples of what those automatic thoughts are, and when we work with people, we bring them through this process in a fairly detailed way, and we help them to identify their own individual patterns of these automatic beliefs. And what the research shows is that there are about 8 identifiable patterns of automatic thinking. And what we put up here are just a few examples. So that first example is something called minimizing, and that would be somebody who says our department budget has been cut in half, but I don't think we'll have any problems meeting our goals for the second quarter. So that person is minimizing actually the negative impacts of what's going on in the environment. They're being a little bit Pollyannish, in fact, about the threats in their environment. The other one's a little bit more common, assuming there's no way my team can meet this new arbitrary deadline. That's an example of an assumption right off the bat. And because that assumption is so quick and so automatic, it influences all that person's behavior down the road. It's all based on that one automatic thought. And then finally, something known as overgeneralizing. Why does my team always get the impossible projects? So people have different patterns of automatic thoughts. Sometimes they're very keyed in on one type of automatic thought, and more commonly people have a combination of automatic thoughts. But one of the things we do with them, with these leaders, is help them identify what their own particular patterns are. So next slide, please. To bring this all back together, let's go through just a little brief scenario here. So the vice president, your team leader, the vice president has changed the deadline and scope of a project for you. Your team reprioritized their efforts. They worked some late nights to get things done. Some of your team members resisted that effort, did not deal well with that kind of change. You had to help them along, provide some coaching for them. And a team delivered, but they didn't get really any recognition from the VP or anybody else that you expected after such a monumental effort. So that's the challenge you've just been through. So let's do another activity. I told you before what that woman's emotions and what her behaviors are. So do me a little favor, and if you think about this, put yourself in that person's shoes. You've just been through this challenge, and let's take these one at a time using that question function again. Let's start with emotions. What are some emotions that, if you're the team leader, you might be experiencing if you're this person? I'll wait a second, and if you could just type into the questions function again, your responses. I think I'm probably doing something a little bit wrong here. I'm not seeing the answers come up for me, but
lots of frustration. Probably 30% of the people are saying frustration, disappointment, anger, disappointment, a lot of frustration.
okay, a lot of frustration. Thank you, Sean. I think I've organized my question panel a little bit awkwardly, so I just can't see them when they're coming through. But okay, that's typical, right? Obviously, you're going to feel a lot of frustration. So what about behaviors then? What, if you're in this person's shoes, you're feeling that frustration, what might you do behaviorally? What would that look like? What would your frustration look like to other people? And Sean, if you don't mind, just give me a hand here and let me know what some of the responses are.
Slamming doors, venting to others, shutting down, yelling, checking out, feeling grumpy, being defensive with others.
Yeah. Okay, so it shows itself in a lot of behavioral ways. You know, just like all of us, we're all human beings. When we're in a bad mood, people are going to recognize it. They're going to see it. It's that emotional contagion that Natalie and David were talking about previously. So if you go to the next slide, please. That's what it looks like. Now, if you engage active thinking, what does it look like? Well, I'm not going to ask you to say what you would do in this scenario because it would take a little bit too long. So we just put up one example of there. One common or very understandable way that a person might respond to this if they're engaging in automatic thinking is just to believe my boss doesn't value me. So nothing me or my team did held any value for the VP. We did all this effort. It fell on deaf ears and blind eyes. So engaging in active thinking to counteract that, what could you do? Well, this person could tell themselves, my boss usually appreciates my work. There could be any variety of reasons why she acted that way. So she's under a lot of her own pressures. She'll get back to me maybe with some recognition, but there are reasons for it. There's no history behind it. That's an example of much more rational, active thinking to counteract those automatic thoughts. So that was just one little scenario to show you how this process works. Let's go on to the next slide. Thanks. So that's challenging automatic beliefs. As Natalie mentioned, there are other strategies that can be used to enhance resiliency, but that really is one of the fundamental ones that we like to promote. So I'm going to hand it back to Natalie at this point, and she's going to help finish us off.
Okay. So if we could move to the next slide, I'm going to talk about leaders' roles in building employees' resilience. And research shows that leaders have a really significant role in enhancing employee resilience, and they can do so by building these 5 core skills. So the first is being a role model. So this means the leader acts with resiliency herself. She shows confidence. She looks beyond her own interests. Basically, the leader models the behavior she wants to see. So people have what neuroscientists call mirror neurons, and this means that just by watching someone do something, this activates the same neurocircuitry in our own brains as if we're the ones acting. The mirror neurons are really critical for learning new skills by imitation. So a great way for leaders to build employee resiliency is simply by modeling resilient behaviors themselves. Next is communicating a higher purpose. And this means providing a compelling higher purpose, motivating employees to look beyond their own interests, and then stimulating your people, providing intellectual and creative stimulation, demonstrating effective problem solving by challenging assumptions, looking for people with different perspectives, and presenting crises as challenges that can be overcome. And this really encourages your subordinates to offer thoughtful solutions to problems rather than hurried or stress-driven ones. The next is knowing your people, considering each employee individually so that each employee feels valued and respected according to their unique needs. So one example of this is asking employees questions about themselves, remembering unique details about employees, changing your interpersonal approach depending on the person that you're interacting with. And finally, rewarding your people, being clear about who's responsible for what and how each accomplishment will be rewarded. So setting clear expectations, maybe even creating a centralized location in the computer system where deadlines and rewards are made explicit. And so those are just examples, and this is kind of an overview of 5 broad essential behaviors of leaders if they want to build their employees' resilience. And then I'm going to throw it back to David to finish us off.
Okay, great. Thank you, Natalie. So as time winds down here, we're going to try and get ourselves into the QA, but just to wrap up the session overall, if you take a look at it, resiliency is a very important skill in today's workplace. We all face hidden barriers to performance, and one of them obviously is the negativity bias and some of the elements that connect very directly to resiliency. And ultimately, the way that you build resilience is by helping people recognize them, those hidden barriers, and also about helping people manage them. And when you do that, resilience can tremendously help individuals. If you think back to some of the statistics at the very beginning around the impact that stress can have on people, but not only can it help individuals, for those of us that are in leadership development roles or in HR roles, it can also help organizations very importantly too, as we navigate the turbulent waters today of change, the fast pace, and everything that we all go through. And when you think about resiliency, not as important for all of us, but it's particularly important for leaders as their actions and their leverage can be magnified through what they do. I think the good news in all of this is that resilience is something that we don't necessarily have to be born with, but it's something that can absolutely be developed over time, and something that can be developed through very specific strategies that you can execute against. So if we go to the next slide, please. Before we get started on the specific questions, there was a number of people that asked for things like, would we share the PowerPoint slide deck with us? Yes, we will. Would we have an on-demand version of this webinar? Yes, there will be as well. And we're also going to provide, for those of you that are looking for some more information on the background research and a few other things, a several-page long white paper on resiliency as well that I think that you'll find has some interesting reading. So last reminder, for those of you who have some questions, go ahead and enter them in the question panel. And we've got a number of them here to go with, but if anybody has any last-minute thoughts, we'd be happy to see if we can't cover those as well, too. And before we go to the QA, this was kind of a product showcase. I did want to point out to the audience that TRACOM Group has built a series of training programs around the resiliency topic, and we entitle those Resilient Mindset and how we go about developing it. So there are courses out there that we've been deploying now for organizations for quite some time, where they've been looking at specific needs that they might have. And this program's been seen as a very good fit in the areas of organizations trying to cover general wellness initiatives for their employees, for organizations that are going through a lot of change, needing to deal with change management initiatives. It's been very good fits for people in leadership skills and management skills as they think about what's needed for people to step up, and also the leverage points. So for those of you that are interested, you'll find at our website a lot of information on those programs. And I think one of the interesting aspects that you'll see in those is that we've also built an assessment instrument which actually measures people's resiliency, both where their natural strengths of resiliency are, as well as where some of their undeveloped areas are, so that when people look at it, think about deciding where they want to build resilience, they can actually pinpoint a strategy that will work for themselves. Next slide, please. For those of you that don't know TRACOM very well, we view ourselves as a social intelligence company. Ultimately, why we exist is that we believe that improving people's understanding of themselves, and not only themselves but of others, can make the world a significantly better place. In essence, what we do is through research and experience, we look to uncover the hidden barriers like the negativity bias, for example, and resiliency for individuals achieving their maximum potential, and then we work through strategies on how it is that we can help people develop those skills. And eventually what we do is we convert those discoveries into learning and development resources that we think can improve people's performance in all parts of their life, work as well as personal. So with that, I think it's time for me to probably transition ourselves into some questions. And I do have a list of questions that was submitted, so I'll go ahead and just review them here quickly. And let me just select a couple. So the first question I have is, when working for somebody else who is chronically negative, can you share with us one way a resilient leader can manage or avoid that negativity bias? That's something I can throw out to either you, Casey, or Natalie.
Sure. Yeah, I'll start at least. I think some of those things that Natalie talked about are really important there. So first and foremost, being a role model. And I've seen this a lot where people, they kind of learn about resilience. They go to the class and they have these aha, eye-opening experiences. And they see how the emotional contagion works, and they see how their own negativity bias is affecting their behavior. So I think once leaders learn about resiliency and how to actually behave in a resilient way, that goes a long way towards influencing other people. Because people pay a lot of attention to the leaders. They pay more attention to them than they do anybody else. So the leader's behavior has a significant influence on others. So that's the first way. If you've got a person who really is chronically negative like this, I think that eventually you have to give them some feedback in that regard, and in a helpful way, I would say. So at some point where it's comfortable and safe, you talk to them about their attitude, their mindset, and the effect that it's having on themselves and other people. And you can use some of the strategies that we didn't go over. You saw them on the screen, but we didn't really talk much about them. But giving that person feedback about their behavior, and then using a goal-setting strategy really with that person, of finding them and hopefully helping them find their own mechanisms, which always works better, of ways that they can set goals for themselves to get their work done, to do it in a positive way. And I think that's at least the first step towards helping that person. And you might even be able to help them just through education and information and informing them about the negativity bias and some of the patterns that you've seen and getting their input on that and how you think that that's affecting their behavior. You know, that in and of itself might help a great deal.
Excellent. Thank you, Casey. I've got another question here that is a little bit more about the culture of an organization, I think, as opposed to a specific individual. This question is it possible to help others to become more resilient when the workplace environment has a high level of leadership shifts? So in other words, all those leadership shifts and the change has kind of caused a cultural environment that ends up with a lot of lack of trust, a lot of lack of skepticism. Would one of you like to take that question?
Sure, I can start out. You know, this gets back to what we really started the presentation with, which was resilient people's responses to change. So this is what distinguishes resilient people from people who aren't very resilient. And once you've learned these strategies and learned these skills, you'll understand that you can respond to change in a much more positive way. So this problem that the person described is all too common, it seems these days, where you've got large-scale change. It's happening a lot. It sounds like a lot of leadership change, which is never easy. That changes the entire culture of the organization sometimes. And that person's quite right. It can lead to some skepticism. So I think what you do is once you learn these strategies of resiliency is you do look for the opportunities within that change. You at least look for what you can influence. So a lot of change is outside of your control. You can't change that the C-level executives are turning over right and left. Excuse me. That's outside of your control. But think about, in a very realistic way, what is within your control in that environment and what you can influence. And that's what you can do. And normally, almost everybody can find something that they can influence, and that is within their control. And so I guess that's where I would lead that person to start, is think about those things and then act based on that.
Okay, excellent. Now, I think I've got a question here that's probably right up your alley. There's been a number of questions here about the impact of resiliency training, developing their skills, the ability for people to change this. What can you comment about research about the results of resiliency training?
Natalie, you're on mute, I believe.
I'm sorry. That's why I wasn't, okay. So yeah, when you kind of do a broad scan of the literature, there's been some research into resiliency training and its effects. And, you know, resiliency training, even kind of micro trainings, you know, 2-hour web-based trainings or 2-hour face-to-face trainings have been associated with some really significant effects. One is, you know, an increase in resilience, an increase in hope and optimism, an increase in manager-rated performance and self-rated performance, lower stress, higher ratings on leadership and engagement. And again, I was talking about those micro trainings. There's evidence that a 2-hour micro training can give you a 270% return on investment. So there's a lot of evidence to show that, you know, training is powerful, training is effective.
Excellent. Thanks, Natalie. There's another good question that's out here about how it is that people can go about measuring resiliency, either when they're hiring employees or in kind of a development role when they're trying to coach employees along. Casey, Natalie, would one of you like to tackle that one quick?
Sure. You know, one way is to ask people about, you know, their past experiences and how they handled it. You know, what kind of challenges have you faced in the past? Give me an example of one really strong challenge that you faced in the past and how did you handle it? And I think that's really revealing of people's resiliency. Another way is to do an assessment, particularly a multi-rater assessment where other people assess the individual on their resiliency, on those, you know, components that I mentioned. And those are just two off the top of my head that are coming to mind.
Great.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I agree. I think what Natalie said is perfect. Really, that behavioral interviewing, especially, because you can do that when you're interviewing somebody without having to do a formal assessment if you don't have that available. So just knowing what to look for in that person's responses and how they've handled challenges will tell you a lot about their resiliency.
Yeah. Well, everybody, I'm afraid we're hitting to that point of the day where we're out of time. We've probably got about a minute or so here left. So just so everybody on the phone knows, we will go ahead and send out a copy through email, access to the webinar online, as well as the individual white papers. There were a lot more questions asked than we were unfortunately able to cover here live. So for any of you that asked questions individually, we will have a record of those, and we'll plan on responding to those to you in the next couple of days. Thank you for joining us here at TRACOM Group for our webinar. I hope what you found both informative and interesting. And have a great day, everyone. Take care.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much to our presenters today, David Collins, Casey Mulqueen, and Natalie Wolfson, and to our moderator, Sean. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. There is a survey that will appear at the end of the webinar. Please take a moment and fill out the survey. We do appreciate your feedback. Have yourselves a great afternoon.